Welcome to the Campaign Trend podcast, where you're joining in on a conversation with the entrepreneurs, operatives, and experts who make professional politics happen. I'm your host, Eric Wilson. Our guest today is retired Major General Arnold Punaro of the United States Marine Corps. For decades, he served on Capitol Hill, including as the staff director of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Today, he runs the Punaro Group, consults for a broad array of Fortune 100 companies, and has been recognized by Defense News as one of the 100 most influential individuals in U.S. defense. He's also the author of If Confirmed, an insider's view of the national security confirmation process. In this episode, General Punaro takes us behind the scenes of the confirmation process, from shortlists to nominations to vetting to hearings and Senate votes, everything that's happening right now on Capitol Hill. So if you want to survive a Senate confirmation hearing today, if you want to survive a Senate confirmation hearing someday, and especially today, take some notes. General Punaro, before someone's name even makes it onto a short list, there are years of preparation that go into a career in national security to even be in that mix. So what does someone listening to us today need to do, or not do for that matter, if they want to become Secretary of Defense or CIA director someday?
Well, Eric, it's a privilege to be with you and your listeners on this really not only critically important topic, but extremely timely topic, because as you know, right now, we have lots of cabinet nominations, lots of senior nominees in the national security field, pending in the committee and pending on the Senate floor. The point is, in the Department of Defense, we have 65 positions that require a presidential nomination and Senate confirmation. We have 5 that relate to the Department of Energy nuclear weapons program. And we have the head of the CIA, we have the director of national intelligence, and a lot of key confirmations required in the intelligence area. So these are all fundamental to our overall national security. And these positions, in terms of their importance, run from the Secretary of Defense, who runs the largest, most complex organization in the world, to the Undersecretary for Acquisition and Sustainment, who's in charge of over $420 billion a year in government spending, to the Secretary of the Navy and the Secretary of the Air Force. So these are incredibly consequential programs. The DOE nuclear weapons program is a $30 billion a year. So you basically, to get to your point, you really do need to have incredible amount of background and experience. And if you look at most administrations, including this one, they're nominating people that basically have that requisite set of capabilities and experience for the jobs to which they've been nominated. Not 100% of the time, but I would say 98% of the time. And so, for example, if you're going to be the head of the National Nuclear Administration in the Department of Energy, you're going to need to be someone typically that's got an advanced degree in a scientific or technical area that relates to the production of very complex, highly technical things. You're going to have to serve in the nuclear labs, or you're going to have served in a previous lower position in the Department of Defense or Department of Energy, worked in industry, basically in the nuclear field, et cetera. And so basically, when you look at the various jobs, for example, pending in the Senate right now is the nomination of Bridge Colby to be the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Bridge is an individual that served in and out of government for decades. He's worked at think tanks. He's written books. He's a very knowledgeable person. And, you know, he's going to be running the whole, if confirmed by the Senate, running the whole policy establishment at the Office of the Secretary of Defense, working daily with the National Security Advisor and even senior officials. And so it requires people, a lot of staffers that have worked on the Hill go into the Pentagon, and they go into areas where they've been the leading expert in that particular area on the Senate or House Armed Services Committee or to the Defense Appropriations Committee. For example, in the military departments, you have an assistant secretary for financial management. They're going to want someone in that position that really understands profit and loss and spreadsheets and how to manage money. And so basically, these jobs are so critically important and so consequential. Typically, you're going to have to spend, for the most senior positions, you're going to have to spend a lifetime getting ready for them. So long-winded answer, but basically you need to be highly qualified.
Yeah, very little on the job training for these really important jobs. It reminds me a lot of sort of like the Olympics. You prepare
Yeah.
for a lifetime, albeit you're on the younger end of your career, but you prepare for a lifetime for that sort of one moment every 4 years when your name could be called up.
Yeah, and you'll have, for example, you'll have people that are going into the government now that years past in a previous administration, they maybe were the deputy assistant secretary of defense for East Asia and the Pacific, or they were the deputy comptroller, lower levels. And so you see people that kind of move up through the food chain over the years in different administrations. So again, lots of background and experience for the individuals going in government, in my judgment, in the national security field. And frankly, we're very blessed because it's been more of a bipartisan approach than you see on the domestic side, where they're just going to always have knockdown, drag out fights because there is such disagreement on the policies and the processes. But in the national security area, it's been pretty consistent from administration to administration. And so we end up, we're blessed to get really qualified people for the most part.
That's good. And so let's jump forward to the point where someone is on that short list of possible nominees. And as you know, and our listeners know, usually those lists get leaked, maybe floated as a trial balloon, or as you might say, run up the flagpole to see if anyone salutes it. What is happening in that phase of the process, and what does a potential nominee need to do to survive?
Well, first of all, you're going to have some affiliation with the administration in power or coming into power, and some of that's going to be very extensive, going back many years. But let's say typically you want to be an undersecretary of defense, and like the undersecretary of defense for intelligence, Brad Hansel. Brad Hansel served on the National Security Council in the previous Trump administration. He's been an expert in this area, career foreign special operator, in uniform, knows this stuff backwards and forwards. So what will happen with him and with his cohorts is the transition team, before the administration gets in power, from when they're elected in November to January 20th, they're going to have these names and they'll do extensive vetting. They'll do financial vetting. They'll do investigations. For each of the nominees in the Senate, they have what's called an FBI full field investigation that typically they want it completed before the president actually makes a decision on somebody. So in case there's some problem, he doesn't put a name out there and all of a sudden
you have to pull back
out later, they have to pull it back. So they're going to go through and they have to fill out mountains of paperwork. The SF-86, which is the security clearance form, the public financial disclosure form. They're going to have to go through the Office of Government Ethics Review. Many of them have to divest of holdings so there's no conflict of interest or a perception of a conflict of interest. So the background is exceedingly detailed in terms of what you have to do. Then you're going to have personal interviews. And one of the questions they're going to ask you is, have you done anything that if it went public, it would embarrass the president? So there are people that get kicked out. They could be totally qualified, pass all the FBI, be in good shape financially, be in good shape with all the politics that goes with it in terms of supporting the president's priorities, and find out, well, wait a minute, we didn't pay FICA wages on our house cleaners, or we did something that was inappropriate, and they say, wait a minute, we're not going to send you up to the United States Senate, because like in the Senate Armed Services Committee, you have to give them copies of your last 3 tax forms. They ask all these kind of questions, your political donations. So in every administration, you have these very, very extensive reviews. The other thing they're going to do is they're going to look at your social media and they're going to look at your public statements and speeches to see if you said or done anything that might be disqualifying. Now, we've had in both administrations people that basically have had tweets that some people, or social media postings that people would think was sort of beyond the pale, but they've gotten through the process anyway. You're going to have a few of those coming up here in the near future in the Trump administration. You had a couple of those in the Biden administration. And by the way, there were several nominees in the Biden administration that did not get through the process because of their social media tweets, and probably shouldn't have gotten through the process. I can't speak to what in Trump, but I'm sure there are going to be some that gather some intense focus there.
Yeah,
so
it's like the old
extensive nature of the review. And by the way, the other thing they tell nominees is you live in a fishbowl. Everything you do is public record. if you go into this position and this was the complaint about Lord Austin when he didn't tell people he was out of pocket on the chain of command. You don't have the right to do that as a senior public official. And so there's a lot that you have to go through to get to the point where the president is willing to nominate you and you're willing to serve under those conditions.
So we've got this really intense scrutiny. You survive that process. Now you're nominated. Then the nominee starts meeting with various senators, and we get those nice photos, those press sprays. But you've been in the room when the doors close and when they happen. What are those meetings like? What are the senators asking a nominee?
Well, first of all, one thing we tell nominees for the office, we call them office calls. There's nothing off the record in an office call. So you're not in a position to say, well, Senator, let me give you some answers off the record. That doesn't exist because anything you say is on the record. Number two, it's a great opportunity for both the senators and for the nominee to get to know each other better. A lot of times they know each other already and you kind of build on that relationship. But senators are going to have a series of questions. One, let me start with a parochial. They're going to have questions about things that are important to them in the state. If they have a big defense, like if they're a submarine maker in their state and this is the nominee be Secretary of the Navy, John Phelan, they're going to ask him, do you support the Virginia class submarines? Do you support the Columbia submarines? Do you understand we need to beef up the submarine industrial base? Then there'll be, also have policy related questions. For example, there's a big debate going on in national security now. Do we need manned fighters? Or can we just go to unmanned systems? Elon Musk has thrown it out there. I'm a war fighter. I haven't found anybody that runs in my circles that think we're in a position to get rid of totally all manned systems. And so senators that have, fighter production in their state or are concerned about that position, they're going to ask the nominee, well, what do you think about what Elon Musk said about whether we can get rid of manned fighters? So it runs the gamut from the serious policy. So the policy people, the people like Bridge Colby going into policy, his assistant secretaries, in all the various areas are going to get serious policy questions. The Senate Armed Services Committee is a policy-based committee. They're a very serious committee on both sides of the aisle. They're very thoughtful and deliberate, and so you're going to get from the parochial stuff for sure, and you're also going to get the serious policy questions. The other thing we tell nominees is, civilian nominees do not have personal views. You only represent the views of the administration. So a lot of times, senator will say, "Well, look, tell me what your personal view is on this." Well, you're not entitled to personal views. You're entitled to represent the administration's position, whatever that is.
Yeah. So you're listening to the Campaign Trend podcast. I'm speaking with retired Marine Corps Major General Arnold Punaro about the national security confirmation process. Okay. We're working our way through this chain. So we've ideally got a nominee with enough support in the committee, and we schedule a hearing. What does the nominee's prep look like for that hearing?
So the nominee will be another reason for the office calls is to find out what's on the senator's mind. So many times senators will say, look, I'm going to ask you this at the hearing. And, the office calls can run 30 minutes, whereas at a hearing you may get 5 to 7 minutes. So the senators can, and the nominee will learn, okay, I got to be able to deal with this. Number two, typically as nominees prepare for hearings, the team, whatever government agency, let's just say the Pentagon, the team basically looks and says, okay, these are going to be the top issues you're going to have to deal with in the confirmation process. So you need to really get up to speed on those issues. And then they'll have what they call, I call them murder boards. Other people call them moot hearings, but practice sessions where, people playing the role of a senator will ask a question and see how they answer it and see how they do and see where areas where they need to improve. And then there's a lot of process type things about how you actually operate a hearing. A lot of nominees have never testified before the Congress, and it can be a very intimidating thing. And so you want them to get comfortable with how they're going to testify, respectful of the senators. We also, and that's why I titled my book, If Confirmed, because the Senate Armed Services Committee I'll ask every nominee, have you done anything to presume the outcome of the confirmation process? You don't get to make decisions. You don't get to pick people that are going to work with you till the Senate actually confirms you. And so we tell the nominees, well, Senator, if confirmed, I'll take a hard look. Senator Dan Sullivan invites every nominee to visit Alaska. And of course, this nominee can say, Senator, if I'm confirmed, I'm certainly one of my first trips is going to be to the great state of Alaska. So, it's but so they spend a lot of time preparing, and which is really important, because what we've learned over the years is if a nominee does not do well in their confirmation hearing, the people that are in the building are looking at it, the military is looking at it, the industry is looking at it, and they don't have a very good impression of that nominee if they don't do a good job in their hearing. And then when they get over in the building, a lot of them aren't that successful. Great. No one expects them to be an expert, a total expert in all these areas, but you certainly need to be knowledgeable enough. The other thing is, we train the nominees or ask the nominees if it's an area where they really are not fully informed. And most of them, in fact, all of them don't have classified briefings before they go through the process. And so in a lot of areas, for example, there's a big debate right now about whether or not we ought to go to a sixth generation fighter to replace the fifth generation fighter, the F-18s, the Joint Strike Fighter, things of that nature. And there's a big debate about that. And one of the reasons the previous Secretary of the Air Force, unfortunately, in my judgment, postponed or canceled the sixth gen is he said it really wouldn't match the threat. So if you're the nominee for Secretary of the Air Force or Undersecretary of the Air Force, until you actually can get that threat briefing, you're not going to be really well informed enough to know whether or not you want to go ahead and restore the sixth gen fighter. Now, many people on the Hill think that and are informed and have had the classified briefing. But for a nominee, to me, I always advise keep your powder dry, because that way, when you get up to speed, once you decide where you come out, you'll have more credibility because you didn't decide it in advance.
Right.
So the biggest mistake nominees make is lack of preparation. So, and if you don't prepare well, it will show in the hearing.
So what is this? You've been on the other side of the dais of this
Yes.
too, as staff director. What are the senators and the staff doing to prepare for that hearing? So they've kind of given the questions away in those office calls.
Right.
What are they?
They also have the Senate Armed Services Committee has a process called Advanced Policy Questions, APQs, and I actually started that in 1987 with Chairman Nunn when I became staff director, because there were so many questions that we wanted nominees to answer, and we wanted to know what their position is, but didn't have time at the hearing. I said, let's come up with these APQs and get all these out on the table and have their written answers. Then we can focus in on the hearing on the things that are really, really important. The APQs have gotten quite lengthy, and so you get all that, and the senators and the staff get those, and they look at those answers, and if they're concerned about an answer, that's going to come up at the hearing. Certainly, if you'll see, for example, when the Secretary of the Navy and the Secretary of the Air Force had their hearing before the SAS, the Army guy Dan Driscoll's already had his hearing, did a great job, and he's awaiting reporting out to the Senate executive calendar from the Senate Armed Services Committee. I guarantee you, senators that have interest in their states for the Air Force and the Navy are going to be asking about, what about the destroyers? What about the submarines? What about the Joint Strike Fighter? What do you think about that? What do you think about drones and how drones are being used? Or if you have a base in your state that's, could be one that's kind of on the margins. Well, what do you think about Moody Air Force Base in Georgia? Isn't that one of the most important tactical fighter bases in the world? So all that. So the parochial. So the staff in their areas that senators, for example, Senator Wicker has put out this really magnificent reform proposal for the acquisition and requirements area, and he's asking, I'm sure, as nominees come, both in the office calls and in the hearing, he's going to be asking them, well, what do you think about my reforms of the acquisition and requirements? Certainly Mike Duffy, who's nominated to be the Undersecretary for Acquisition, he's going to have all kind of questions for him on that. I mean, I'm not saying this because I have any inside information. I'm just saying it because I know exactly how the process will work. So the senators and the staff, they spend a lot of time, too, getting ready for these hearings. Senate Armed Services Committee is a very, very serious, thoughtful, objective committee. And that's why their 65 nominees really need to be well prepared.
Yeah. it is, and it does seem like you're taking a lot of input from people in your state. Those bases, those supply chains, all the people who depend on those bases. So we're now at the hearing, okay, and it's pretty much been an open book test to this point, right? Where the questions that you're going to ask. What is it's always seemed to me that these Senate hearings tend to be like kabuki theater, where you're trying to get drama. Maybe not so much in the national security area, but what is a senator looking to get out of those hearings? What does success look like for him or her?
Well, so success, if it's on the merits, it's getting the nominee to support something the senator's in favor of, or whether it's a weapon system in their state or a policy they're pushing. If you're in favor of more aid for Ukraine, you want to get the nominees to say, yeah, that's right, we got to really support Ukraine, or we got to support Taiwan. We don't want China taking over Taiwan. And so success. Now, if you are going to oppose a nominee, you're going to try to get stuff on the record that helps you make the case why this person is not suitable and not qualified for that particular position. And so that's fairly rare, because if you go back and look, most of the nominees for the national security things, they get through the Senate Armed Services Committee pretty quickly. The problem we've run into in recent administrations is the slow roll once they get on the Senate executive calendar. I mean, we had an Assistant Secretary of Defense for Manpower and Reserve Affairs in the last administration that was highly qualified. No one had any concerns about the individual or his qualification. He took 18 months to get through the Senate because he just sat on we had the deputy under for acquisition that was slow roll for a year because one of the senators had concerns about something EPA was doing in their state. And they thought if they put pressure on DOD could pressure EPA, which of course never works. Right. So what they try to get out of the hearing is something that basically supports. And, your home interest, if you've got home interest, they love it when the senator talks about, back home, and they like to kind of talk about that so the constituents can see.
Yeah, you got that clip for social media and the news.
This is what's really so different with the executive branch and the legislative branch. Legislatures are there because the people in their states or their districts elected them, and they have to basically represent them. Whereas the executive branch, even though the president was elected at large, none of the rest of the people were elected to anything. So the president and the vice president are only two people in the executive branch that get elected. Everybody else gets nominated, confirmed, and appointed, and so there's a big difference in their perspective in many cases. And the things, a lot of the issues, how much is the top line? What's happening with the Department of Government Efficiency? Is Elon Musk really going to be cutting the defense budget? And what standing does he have? All these questions, will come up. Again, we actually only have, of the 65, we only have one person confirmed in the DOD, which is a SecDef. We also have 16 other nominations pending now. Only one of those 16 has actually had a hearing, Dan Driscoll, to be Army. The others are still in the paperwork process. And so it's not the DOD's fault, but they're running behind in the administration with the FBI full field and the ethics reviews. And so the Senate Armed Services Committee is quite anxious to get some more hearings going, but the paperwork's not ready.
That is a really interesting insight that I've gotten from our conversation today, is that the process seems to really favor people who have been through it before, right? So if it's just a matter of, hey, we're going to update your FBI full field over the last 4 years while there is a different administration, that's going to be a lot easier than, hey, you're totally from the outside, you've never had this done before, the SF-86, you don't have the clear, So it really is, it does seem geared towards someone who's gone through the process before.
Yeah, and the administrations are more comfortable because they've already been vetted and they've already gotten through the Senate. For example, if you've never been through before and you're doing the SF-86, and let's say you've been in industry and you've traveled all over the world, you have to list everything you've done since you were in high school. You have to list every country you visited. You have to list every person you met with in that country, and then the FBI has to track all those people down. I mean, it is very, very time consuming, and so and also. If you are a current government employee, you probably don't have any money, so you don't have a complex financial situation. That's why we're seeing more and more people, from government put in these positions. And you're also seeing in both Democrat and Republican administrations, which I never saw years ago. They're picking career civil servants to be senior political appointees.
Wow.
And of course, they've lived kind of the government disclosures for years. And so their challenges are not as great as somebody coming in. But some of the people that are coming into the Pentagon, God bless them, they're making incredible financial sacrifices to do this, and it's complicated, and they have to get through that. And the standard of conduct office in the Pentagon, the government ethics people are quite rigid in terms of making sure you're recused from anything that would be a conflict of interest or a perception of conflict of interest. So the I'm not one that worries about protecting the taxpayer. The protections are there. They're in statute, they're in rules, they're in regulations. And our Department of Defense is the people that keep up with this in DOD are really, really particular and really keep the pressure on both the government employees and the political appointees. There's a lot going on around now about what Elon Musk's situation is with the Doge. And they said he's a special government employee. You actually have to fill out a lot of forms to be a special government employee. So I don't have any insights
Talk about
there.
a complex financial situation.
Absolutely. And he also has government contracts. So he would never make it in a Pentagon position for sure because of all that. But the ones that are going into the Pentagon, the Senate Armed Services Committee has very stringent divestiture rules. You can't own anything in the top 10 over a rolling 5-year period, and other things you have to be recused from. So it's very, very stringent.
Wow. So just to wrap up the process, you kind of alluded to it with the holds that we've seen recently. But once the nominee gets a successful vote out of the committee, they get placed before the full Senate. Are there any cases where someone loses the vote, where that vote is not a done deal?
That is very rare, because if typically, if you don't have the vote in committee, you're not going to get reported to the Senate executive calendar. Now, technically, a committee can, instead of bottling a nomination up that's controversial in committee, could actually report the nomination to the Senate, recommending disapproval and not approval, and the Senate could vote on that. Most of the time, if they don't have the votes in committee, they don't get out of committee, and that certainly, there were some in the Biden administration, some in the first Trump administration, that never got out of committee. You've had a couple of the cabinet nominees, get on the Senate executive calendar. Hegseth was a 50-50, and the tie was broken by the vice president, 51-50. And so you don't need 100 votes anymore. You only need a majority. You need, 50-51. So it's rare that they get voted down, once they're on the executive calendar. Now, you can get somebody on the executive calendar, and if there's a hold on them, either a merit-based hold because somebody thinks you're unqualified, or a hold related to something that the nominee has nothing to do with, then the majority leader has to decide whether or not they're going to file cloture on that nomination, have a cloture vote, which they're going through for all the Trump cabinet nominees. Russell Watt, got his cloture vote, and then they're 30 hours post-cloture debate that the Democrats are running out the clock, and he'll get voted on tonight, and he'll get confirmed. It'll probably be a total party line vote, and so that can happen. And then if the majority leader doesn't ever want to bring up cloture on somebody, then they never get through the Senate. So there was like 150 pending nominees at the end of the Biden administration on the executive calendar that never got confirmed for various reasons. Some of them came up very late in the process. We had 5 DOD nominations at the end of the last Trump administration, all highly qualified, got out of the Armed Services Committee on a bipartisan basis, got on the Senate executive calendar, but never got confirmed because it was at the end of the administration, and they were just prioritizing judges and getting cloture on judges and not getting cloture on DOD noms. So yes, you can get out on the Senate executive calendar and not get through, but rarely does a nominee that gets out of committee get voted down in the Senate.
Well, my thanks to General Punaro for a great conversation. Obviously, not only knowledgeable of the process, but helped make the process for national security nominations and confirmations in the Senate. You can learn more about him in the show notes, and I'll include a link to his book, If Confirmed, which is a great read if you're looking at understanding this process. If we always ask you that if this episode made you smarter, and I think we learned a lot, All we ask is that you share it with a colleague or a friend, and you look smarter in the process. More people learn about the show. It's a win-win all around. Remember to subscribe to the Campaign Trend podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, and you'll never miss an episode. Visit our website at campaigntrend.com. With that, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.